So our second article today will be presented by Samuel Stäbler from Tilburg University in the Netherlands and Marc Fischer from the University of Cologne in Germany. Their research examines how the media reports on acts of corporate misconduct, what they call corporate social irresponsibility, including things like environmental offenses, corruption, or violating societal standards around human rights or employee working conditions. Here's a spoiler alert. There is bias in this reporting, as they'll share with you. And the question is, what is the nature of this bias, and what can companies do about it? So welcome, Samuel and Marc. We look forward to learning about these results.
Chris, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and we are very grateful for the opportunity to present our paper today. It's titled, When Does Corporate Social Irresponsibility Become News? Evidence from more than 1,000 brand transgressions across 5 countries. Events of corporate social irresponsibility are spread across the news all over the world. Volkswagen and its pollution scandal. La corrupción toca a Walmart de Mexico. Corruption at Walmart in Mexico. Massenschlägerei bei Apple-Zulieferer in China. Bad working conditions at Apple factories in China. And such negative headlines and such negative media coverage of corporate social irresponsibility is spread across the world and can have a detrimental impact on financial performance measures of firms. As we see from the chart, Volkswagen's share price has dropped dramatically by more than 30% after the pollution scandal was announced in the press. If the scandal would have not been announced in the press, maybe the effect on the shareholders would not have been as bad as it was. Indeed, the media highly influences what we think about the world and how we perceive companies. Tons of literature has shown that the news media shapes our perception. And what we have noticed in real life is that there is actually a huge variance of media coverage of very similar crisis events. Some crisis events of companies are highly covered in newspapers, and others just don't make it into the news. So just to give you an example, from 10 major US newspaper outlets, 90% reported about Goldman Sachs being accused of fraud, but only 20% reported about JP Morgan being accused of fraud. So why the heck is there such a huge difference? Well, that's something we wanted to study. And again, as we see from the charts, if media coverage is very high, it has a strong negative impact, in this case on customer perceptions of brand strength. But when media coverage is low, it does not really impact customer perception of brand strength. Thus, media coverage determines how we perceive firms and brands. Again, 2 banks are accused of the same wrongdoing, but media coverage differs. Why? Well, from the view of a journalist, it's per se not possible to report about everything that happens in the world. So what journalists do is they take a selection of what is new to becoming news. But what are the underlying criteria of how journalists select news, and what can companies do to influence their coverage in the newspapers? Well, this leads to our focal research question. What are the criteria that determine newspapers to report about brand transgressions? And how does media coverage of brand transgressions actually influence the financial consequences on stock markets? We investigate many different factors that may influence the editorial content of newspapers based on the theory of news values. Well, it's a theory that has gained wide acceptance to explain the selection process of news. The theory contains a lot of different news factors that determine media coverage. So, for example, we study to what degree popular firms are more likely to face negative press. Additionally, we also study whether newspapers are more likely to criticize foreign companies than national companies for being involved in unethical behavior. And most importantly, we also studied if firms that place advertisements in specific news outlets can hinder newspapers to report about corporate misbehavior. And that's a very interesting question. because whenever I talk to newspaper editors told me that the editorial content of the newspaper would never be influenced by advertisers. Never. Let's see if this is true. So in the empirical setting, we covered a large set of corporate brands from 5 countries, such as the US, Mexico, Germany, UK, and France. Thus, we cover countries from different continents and also include 1 emerging country. So we analyzed a huge set of corporate brands in these countries. And the daily consumer perception of these brands are covered by the market research company YouGov. And this data helps us to identify the drivers of media coverage. So in the bubbles on the left side of the screen, you just see some example brands that are covered in the data set. We cover global corporate brands such as Apple and Volkswagen that are active in all countries. But we also cover smaller brands, for example, Barnes & Nobles that mainly run their businesses in the US. And for more than 300 different of these corporate brands, we identified crises and investigated if and under which conditions newspapers actually reported about these corporate brands and their crisis. In total, we investigated 77 high-reach newspapers in 5 countries. So for example, in the US, we covered USA Today, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, and 50 newspapers in total. And basically, we checked which of these newspapers reported about a brand transgression. Clearly, all of the newspapers that you see on the slide reported about the Volkswagen pollution crisis, but there are many, many minor crisis events that take place somewhere in the world that have never been noticed by the society because only 1 or 2 newspapers reported about them. So maybe some of these crisis events never made it into the news because companies had advertising relationships with the media. Let's see. So in the empirical setting, we concentrated on corporate social irresponsibility events. We looked at environmental issues, which is the violation of environmental surroundings, for example, the BP oil leak in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. We looked at social issues, which is the violation of human rights and poor working conditions. And finally, we looked at governance issues, which relate to bribery, breach of trust, price fixing, etc. Our sample contains 1,053 corporate social irresponsibility events. And we checked for all of the newspapers whether they have reported about the event or not. We have more than 30,000 observations. So we individually checked more than 30,000 times in 4 different languages whether a corporate social irresponsibility event is reported in a specific newspaper outlet or not. So basically, the only thing I did the last 5 years of my life was reading newspaper articles about corporate social irresponsibility events. The more I'm happy that I can present my results to you in a second. By the way, technically speaking, for the ones of you who are interested in econometric analysis, we used a multi-level logic model to determine the impact of several factors on the likelihood that a newspaper reports about a CSI event. And additionally, we used the methodology of an event study and the Pharma-French 4-factor model to investigate the consequences of corporate social irresponsibility events on stock markets. Anyways, okay, let's take a look at some descriptive results. Interestingly, if we take a look at the most criticized brands, we see that Apple is always in the top 3 in each country. Another brand which is always criticized is Google. In most of the countries, we also have a grocery market that is highly criticized. For example, in the US, it's Walmart. In UK, it's Tesco. So the top popular brands face more negative news than any other company. However, our estimation results yield even more surprising results. First and most important, and contrary to what newspaper editors actually told me, we find that advertising spending in newspapers leads to a lower likelihood of facing bad press. Thus, if I run my advertisements in a newspaper, I do not only advertise for my brands, but I also protect my brands from negative consequences. And if a company has an exclusive advertising partnership, which means that a company chooses to run their advertisements only in one specific major media outlet in a country for some time, it further decreases the probability to be covered in newspapers in a negative way. On average, about 1 out of 5 outlets cover a corporate social irresponsibility event. So nearly 20% of newspapers report about the corporate social irresponsibility event. But only 10%, about 1 out of 10 newspapers, cover the story when the involved brand is in a selective advertising partnership. Thus, advertising in newspapers helps companies to influence the editorial content of newspapers. Second, we confirm that salient and strong brands such as Apple and Coca-Cola face a much higher likelihood to face bad press. 39% more media cover stories on salient and strong brands. In addition, we find that media outlets slant foreign companies. Domestic crisis events caused by foreign brands are more likely to be covered in the newspapers. So if Volkswagen behaves unethically in the US, the likelihood to face bad press from US newspapers is much higher than if a national company, for example Ford, is involved in unethical firm behavior. Indeed, 80% more media report the event if a foreign brand is involved in a domestic corporate social irresponsibility event. It seems like newspapers want to protect their own economy and thus are more critically towards foreign companies than they are towards national companies. Another interesting finding is that left-oriented media outlets are more likely to report on a corporate social irresponsibility event than right-oriented newspapers. We argue that profit-oriented companies and their representatives are the natural enemy of left-oriented ideologies. News about corporate misbehavior, therefore, is most welcome in the fight against the power of these companies, which fits into the frame of reference for readers of left-oriented newspapers. In the end, all of these drivers of media coverage determine whether a company has a financial loss on the US stock market or not. Our study finds that the US stock market reacts in a negative way, but only if 4 or more US media outlets report on unethical firm behavior. Thus, if media coverage is low, the stock market does not react. If media coverage is high, the average financial loss yields $321 million. Therefore, the drivers of media coverage make the difference of whether the stock market reacts. Additionally, the drivers of media coverage determine the magnitude of the financial loss. Just to give you one example, if a brand is salient to consumers, the brand does not only lose $321 million, but loses $337 million. And that's what we call the brand salience effect. On the other hand, if a company places advertisements in a newspaper, the financial loss may decrease by $31 million. Additionally, another finding of the study is if a company launches other news, for example, if a company introduces a new product in times of crisis, it decreases the likelihood to be covered in the news in a negative way, and thus also decrease the financial loss on the stock markets by $88 million. So it may totally make sense to launch other news in times of crisis. Overall, these financial effect strengths are remarkable and therefore also yield important implications for managers. Our study educates managers. Be aware that corporate social irresponsibility events are not equally covered in the media. This may help managers and also investors predict and anticipate media attention. Furthermore, we find that other brand news crowd out negative news. Therefore, companies should try to create other news whenever they are involved in negative news. Additionally, local brand name strategies may be a way to reduce the likelihood to face bad press in foreign countries. Our study has shown that newspapers are more likely to criticize foreign companies than national companies if their economy and their own country might be affected by the crisis of the firm. Furthermore, we challenge the view that strong brands can protect companies from the negative consequences of crisis. The study actually shows the opposite. Strong brands are more likely to face bad press and thus have a higher likelihood to suffer on stock markets. And last but not least, advertising investments reduce the likelihood to be covered negatively. Thus, this study demonstrates that companies can influence the editorial content of newspapers by having good relations with the media. Finally, this study also contributes to the society. Our results are not only important for managers, but also for investors, consumers, and policymakers. The fact that we identify critical factors that influence newspapers raises strong concerns about whether the newspapers fulfill their information role for the society. Consumers have the right to be informed about potential firm misbehavior in a transparent and balanced manner. However, our study shows that media coverage varies significantly when it comes to reporting about unethical firm behavior. This should encourage us to think about what to believe from newspapers. Actually, this study shows that advertising relationships have the power to deter media from covering negative stories. Should policymakers get active to reduce media bias and ensure fair coverage of unethical behavior? Our study does not enable us to make any specific recommendation about the usefulness of additional regulations, but it contributes to creating transparency about the issue and hopefully initiates a discussion about proper measures. In this sense, thank you very much for the attention, and Marc and I, we are very happy to answer questions. Oh, next slide.
Very good. Thank you, Samuel. Appreciate it very much. So, so again, we have an opportunity now for questions, so please go ahead and type those into the Q&A tab. We do have a question here from Daniel about, did your research take into account if there were other big news stories that were happening, you know, maybe not those associated with the firm itself, which you commented on, but other things that were happening in the news that may have, you know, taken attention away from covering the firm's misconduct. Did your study account for that?
What we took into consideration are firm-specific news. So if I launch some news that relate to my own firm, for example, a new product introduction or a sponsorship announcement, in our econometric specification, we also control for other news, but we do not consider this as a variable. So that's something we did not focus on in this study.
Okay. Well, you know, I guess the assumption would be that it's making more noise in the background, that it's not, if your effects show up regardless, I think if your effects didn't show up, that might be an explanatory factor, but your effects did show up, so I think it's probably not a big issue. Well, you mentioned, and I think for me, one of the most interesting parts of the paper is this idea of these advertising partnerships, especially those that are more selective. So are these very common for the media outlets? Do they have these kinds of partnerships in place? Is it something that we should be worried about?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of firms have these exclusive selective advertising partnerships with the media. Actually, in our data set, 49 out of 296 brands did advertise in only one media outlet for some time before the brand was involved in a corporate social irresponsibility event. So nearly 20% of the brands in our data set did this. So this is definitely highly relevant to many companies.
And Elena has a question about, oh, go ahead, Marc.
Maybe just something to add. This exclusive partnership does not mean that they advertise only there for years. It's a 6-month period where this is actually the focus of the advertisement, and that's targeted to that specific outlet.
Okay, very good. So Elena has a follow-up question. She's curious if these 4 media outlets that you uncovered as the number, is there something that binds them together, something that they have in common with one another? They're not owned by the same parent? Are they, or is there something else that you observed about those media companies that do the reporting?
Well, we actually did not look into the characteristics of these specific 4 media outlets, and although the question behind that is, are these always the same? I don't think so, but that was not really the question of this research, and I think this opens up some interesting further research questions, especially about the specific outlets. Are there maybe some outlets, if I just pick the Wall Street Journal now, is that having a higher likelihood of picking up on specific news and a higher likelihood of investors that react to that specific journal? But that's something we did not really look into in this specific research here.
Okay. Well, Alexander has a question that I had, which was about how your results are actually related to the Yash and Nushin paper. So, because I guess the question is, you studied, and maybe this is more speculation on your part because I don't think you've collected this sample, but you've studied these acts of misconduct, but you might say that these, the CSA acts that they've studied are, I guess they're intended to be positive. Does the coverage, do you expect the coverage to vary? Would it depend on whether it's negative or positive, or do these big, strong brands get covered more? Do the media partners, do they cover more of the positive events? So is the flip side also, does the flip side also hold?
First of all, what we see in the data is, oh, sorry, Marc, go ahead, please.
No, go. You can go.
All right. So what we usually see is a negativity bias. So of course, the media is more likely to report about negative issues. In a related research project, we also look at positive corporate social responsibility activities, and we do find that the media is more likely to report about bad stuff that happen in the world. And of course, they are more likely to report about bad stuff of popular and more salient brands, and the same also accounts for positive news. The media is more likely to report more positive news about Apple than minor or less popular companies. So the answer would be yes, this was not part of this specific research project, but in general, the news media is more likely to report about more salient and more popular firms.
Very good. And so what can, say, a foreign firm, you noticed in your results that the foreign firms are much more likely to be called out for corporate misconduct by the domestic papers. So what can a foreign firm do to protect itself from the negative news coverage that, the foreign news press brings to it in its coverage of the firm? Is there anything that they can do, in your view?
Well, first of all, companies could try to protect their firms from negative news by conducting a local brand name strategies, where this alone can hardly be the main reason to adapt a local brand name strategy. It should at least be considered in these often difficult strategic decisions. And additionally, companies might also consider the strategic launch of other brand news when being confronted with the possible reporting of unethical firm behavior, because other brand news have the power to crowd out the negative corporate social irresponsibility news, as the analysis shows.
Very good. So Anna has a question about how did you actually identify whether the individual firm that had engaged in the misconduct, whether they advertised on each of the newspapers that you studied? Were you able to get information from those companies, or did you collect that externally?
We have worked together with this.
Yeah, I think some of
Sorry,
that,
Marc,
that's
go
a
ahead.
specific data question, right? I mean, we have that data available from a market research company, and they track specifically which firm or which brand has been advertised in which newspaper, so that allows for the identification.
So yeah, so the answer is you had very clear. Yeah, you had very clear information there then. So you mentioned earlier, just maybe a final question, is that you mentioned about the fact that your study challenges the view that strong brands can protect the company. In fact, you find the exact opposite, right? So what would you, is there anything else that you would say to a manager? It seems like this is a bit of a risk then for having a strong brand, that you're going to draw attention. Hopefully you probably also draw positive attention, but you are going to draw more attention when you have misconduct. So any other suggestions or recommendations to marketers listening to this, managing their brands?
Well, maybe some specific outcome we see here. If we look at this threshold effect, that you actually do not have this substantial financial impact at the stock market, if it's 3 or less outlets reporting on the news, and that is influenced by the advertising strategy and the other factors that we showed. I think this also sheds some light on the allocation of the advertising money, because nowadays a lot of this money is shifted from traditional print, be it on an offline or online version, to online media, search advertising and so on. But it shows that the investment in print advertising actually might have a value to protect against these kinds of events that might happen. So that's one.
Wonderful.
One aspect.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think that's a great suggestion. So thank you, Samuel and Marc. We really appreciate you sharing your research with us today. It's just fascinating. So thank you.